A man paid $4,000 for a machine nobody else in that field would touch. And the strange part wasn't the money. It was that not a single one of the 30 people standing there tried to stop him or outbid him. They just watched like they already knew something he didn't, or maybe like they were waiting to see how bad it was going to get for him. The auction had been running for over an hour by then, and most of the good equipment was already gone, tractors that still started, attachments that still had a few seasons left in them, things you could put straight to work without thinking too hard about it. And that was what most men came for, not projects, not risks, not something that hadn't run in over 10 years. By the time they got to that machine, people weren't really paying attention anymore. Not in the way they had been earlier. It was just another lot to get through before moving on, except this one didn't move. The auctioneer called for a number, then lowered it again, and still nobody said anything. A couple men glanced over. One of them shook his head before the price even settled, like he'd already done the math in his head and didn't need to hear the rest. That was when Earl Whitaker spoke. He didn't raise his hand, didn't step forward, didn't even look around to see who might be watching. He just said the number like it had been decided a long time ago. 4,000. It landed wrong. You could feel it. The auctioneer stopped mid-motion, looked up at him to make sure he heard it right. 4,000. Earl nodded once. No explanation. No follow-up. Just the number. What happened next was quieter than it should have been. Nobody challenged it. Nobody even tested it. Not one counter-bid. Not even from a man who made a living buying broken equipment and turning it around. That was the part people remembered later. It wasn't that Earl bought a dead machine. It was that everyone else decided, at the exact same moment, not to. The auctioneer went through the motions anyway, called it once, then twice, and each time it felt like someone might step in, like someone would finally say, wait a minute, maybe we missed something, but it never came. The sale closed just like that. Earl reached into his pocket, took the receipt, folded it once, and put it away like he'd just bought feed or a used gate, not something that had been sitting dead for over a decade. A man from the co-op walked over after, the kind of man who had already bought half a dozen pieces that morning, the kind who knew what things were worth because that was his job. He nodded toward the machine. You know, it hasn't run since the 70s, right? Earl didn't look back at it. I know, he said. That should have been the end of it, but the man didn't move. He waited like he expected more. Maybe a reason, maybe a defense, something to make the decision make sense. Earl gave him nothing else. That's why nobody else wanted it, he added, and then he walked away. That answer didn't settle anything. If anything, it made it worse, because it meant he understood exactly what everyone else saw and still came to a different conclusion. And that was the problem. Every man standing there had already made the same calculation. Machine doesn't run. Parts are old. Time to fix it isn't worth it. Risk too high. Move on. That's how it works when you've been around long enough. You learn to walk away fast. You don't waste time trying to save something that's already done. Earl had been around just as long as any of them. Longer than some. He'd seen engines fail in the middle of harvest, seen gearboxes come apart when they shouldn't, seen machines that looked fine on the outside turn into money pits the second you open them up. He knew the risk. That's what made the number strange. He wasn't guessing. He wasn't hoping. He had already decided. The question wasn't whether the machine was bad. Everyone knew it was bad. The question was what he thought was. Still good enough inside it to take that risk anyway. And that was the part nobody else could see, because none of them had looked the way he had. While the rest of them had stood back and judged it in a few seconds, Earl had been under it earlier that morning, flat on his back in the dirt, running his hands along the frame, checking the parts that actually mattered, not the ones that made it look worse than it was. He didn't care about the missing panels or the rust on the outside. He was looking for things that don't show unless you get close enough to see them, the kind of things that tell you whether something is finished or just sitting still. Most people don't take the time to find that out. They don't need to. Most of the time, the quick answer is good enough. That morning, it wasn't. Earl drove out of that lot with a receipt in his pocket and a decision already behind him. And by the time the rest of the men finished their coffee and moved on to the next auction, they had already forgotten about the machine, except for one thing, the number. For $1,000 for something they wouldn't have taken for half that. It didn't sit right. Not because it was expensive, but because it didn't make sense. And when something doesn't make sense, it stays with you longer than it should. What none of them knew yet What none of them could have known standing there that morning was that the real cost of that decision wasn't going to be $4,000. That was just the part you could write down. The rest of it hadn't started yet. If you're going to understand why Earl Whitaker said that number without hesitation, you have to understand one thing first. He wasn't the kind of man who guessed. Not with money, not with machinery, not with anything that could cost him a season if he got it wrong. He grew up in a place where getting it wrong wasn't an inconvenience. It was something you paid for all year. The farm he was raised on wasn't big, wasn't easy, and it didn't leave room for mistakes. His father didn't replace things when they broke, because replacing things meant spending money they didn't have. He fixed them, over and over again. Engines, pumps, gearboxes, whatever stopped working got taken apart on a wooden bench in a shed that smelled like oil and old metal. And if it went back together wrong, you didn't find out in theory, you found out when it failed again under load. Earl learned that early, not by being taught in any formal way, but by standing there long enough to see what worked and what didn't. He learned what mattered and what didn't, what you could ignore and what you couldn't afford to miss. He learned how to listen to a machine before it failed, not after. That kind of knowledge doesn't come from books. It comes from time, repetition, and enough mistakes to understand where the real ones happen. He left for a while, like most men do at some point. Spent a few years working in a machine shop outside of Dayton, the kind of place where things had to be right the first time because there wasn't anyone coming behind you to fix it later. That's where he got faster. Not sloppier, just faster at seeing problems before they showed up in measurements. The foreman there once told him he had a way of knowing when something was off before the instruments caught it, like he could feel it in how the parts sat together. Earl didn't think much of that. To him, it was just paying attention. He came back to the farm after that, took over more of the work when his father slowed down, and for the next 20 years he did what farmers do. Grew what the land would give him, fixed what broke, made it through good years and bad ones without much difference in how he approached either. He wasn't rich, never tried to be, but he wasn't careless either. If he spent money, it was because he had already decided it would come back. That's the part people got wrong about the auction. They thought he took a chance. He didn't. He made a calculation. The difference is what you do before you decide. Most of the men at that sale looked at the machine and saw exactly what it was: old, worn out, incomplete, too far gone to bother with. They weren't wrong. Everything they saw was true. What they didn't do was look past that. Not because they couldn't, but because there was no reason to. There were better options sitting 30 yards away. Machines that still ran. Machines you could use immediately. That's what made sense. Earl ignored those. He went straight to the one that didn't make sense. When he got under it that morning, he wasn't looking for reasons to buy it. He was looking for reasons not to. That's how he worked. Start with the assumption that it's not worth it, and see if the machine proves you wrong. Most of them do. This one didn't. The frame was the first thing. You can't fake that. If the structure is gone, everything else is a waste of time. He checked the weld points, the stress areas, the spots where years of use usually show up in ways you can't fix without replacing the whole section. It wasn't perfect, but it wasn't broken in the way that ends things. Then the engine block. It looked bad on the outside. Everything did, but that didn't mean much. He traced the lines, checked for cracks where they usually start, places heat and pressure do their worst over time. He didn't find what he expected to find. Not clean, not good, but not finished either. That was the difference. The machine wasn't dead. It was sitting. There's a difference between something that's worn out and something that's been left alone too long. Most people treat them the same. Earl didn't. He didn't need it to be perfect. He needed it to be salvageable. That's a lower bar, but a much harder one to judge, because it doesn't show itself unless you know where to look. The failure that had taken it out of service. He could see traces of it without taking anything apart. It had been serious, not a minor issue. The kind of failure that makes someone park a machine and decide it's not worth fixing. That part he didn't ignore. He factored it in. But he also knew something else. Most machines don't get retired because they're impossible to fix. They get retired because fixing them costs more than replacing them at the time. That's not the same thing. Cost changes. Time changes. What doesn't change is what the machine is made of. That's what he was judging. Not what it looked like that morning. Not what it had been worth 10 years ago, but what it could still be made into with enough work. And that's where his number came from. It wasn't based on the machine as it sat. It was based on the machine as it could be minus the cost of getting it there. He didn't need anyone else to agree with that number. In fact, he expected them not to. That's how it usually goes. The more obvious something looks, the less likely people are to question it. That machine looked like a bad idea, so nobody questioned it. Earl did. That's why he was the only one who said anything when the auctioneer called for a bid. By the time he left that lot, he already knew what the next few months were going to look like, at least in broad terms. He knew it wasn't going to be quick. He knew it wasn't going to be cheap. What he didn't know, what he couldn't know yet, was how far off his first calculation was going to be once he started taking it apart. Because looking at a machine and opening it up are two different things. And what you find after that first bowl comes loose is where decisions like that either hold or fall apart. The machine didn't come home under its own power. It came in on a borrowed trailer 2 days later, chained down hard, tires barely holding air, looking no better in Earl's yard than it had at the edge of that auction lot. Maybe worse now that it was sitting somewhere, it was expected to become something again. Earl didn't wait. He didn't let it sit while he got around to it. He cleared space in the shed that same afternoon, moved what needed moving, pushed it in, shut the doors, and started taking it apart before the light was gone. That was always the first real step. Not looking at it, not thinking about it, taking it apart, because that's when the truth shows up. You can stand over a machine for an hour and convince yourself of anything you want, but once you start pulling parts, once things come loose in your hands, once you see what's underneath instead of what's on top, there's no guessing left. It either holds together or it doesn't. The first few hours didn't tell him much he didn't already know. Belts that needed replacing, bearings that had sat too long, lines that had to come out. All expected, all part of the number he had in his head. He worked methodically, piece by piece, setting things aside in order, not piling anything up, not rushing. By the end of the first day, the outside had started to come off. By the end of the second, he was getting into the systems that mattered. That's where it changed. The failure that had taken the machine out years ago wasn't just one thing. It had spread. The main drive shaft wasn't just worn. It was fractured, not clean, not recent. A stress crack that had been building for a long time before it finally gave way. And when it failed, it didn't stop there. It had pushed force into the housing around it in a way that warped more than it should have. That wasn't a quick fix. That wasn't something you cleaned up and put back together in a weekend. That was the kind of damage that makes people walk away. Earl stood there with the shaft in his hands for a long minute, turning it slightly, looking at where it had given out. He hadn't seen that from underneath. He couldn't have. That's the part about calculations like his. They're only as good as what you can see. Everything else is risk. He didn't say anything. There was no one there to say it to anyway. He set the shaft down, went back to the housing, checked it again, slower this time. The damage was real. Not fatal, but real. It meant one of two things. Either he found a replacement, which wasn't going to be easy for a machine that old, or he had the housing machine back in a spec, which wasn't going to be cheap. That was the first adjustment to his number. Not enough to break it, but enough to feel it. He kept going. That's the thing about work like that. You don't stop every time something gets worse than you expected. If you did, you'd never finish anything. You take note, you add it to the total, and you move to the next part. The engine came next. That was the one he'd been most careful with at the auction. It hadn't shown signs of being seized, and that had been one of the reasons he bid at all. Now he had to find out if that was true, or if he'd just missed it. He pulled what needed pulling, opened it up enough to check the critical points. It turned. That was good, but turning doesn't mean healthy. He took the block to a shop a few towns over to have it measured properly. The numbers came back worse than he'd hoped. 2 cylinders worn past, where new rings would solve anything. Not destroyed, but not something you ignore either. The shop could sleeve them, bring them back within tolerance, but it wasn't a small job. It was time. It was money. It was another line added to a total that was already moving. That night, for the first time since the auction, Earl sat at the kitchen table with the numbers in front of him. Not guesses anymore. Not rough estimates. Real costs. The machine. The drive shaft problem. The housing. The engine work. He wrote them down one by one. Not rushing. Not skipping anything. Adding them the way he always did, carefully enough that he didn't have to check it twice. His wife, June, sat across from him with her own notebook open. She handled the farm's books. Always had. She didn't interrupt while he wrote. She didn't need to. When he finished, He turned the page slightly so she could see it. She read it once, then again, slower. "That's more than you said it would be," she said finally. It wasn't an accusation, just a fact. Earl nodded. "Yeah." She tapped the edge of the paper with her finger. "And that's not everything yet. Another fact." Earl didn't argue that either. "No," he said. For a few seconds, neither of them spoke. Not because there was nothing to say, but because they both knew what the next part of the conversation was without having started. This was the point where most people reassess, where you decide if you're still in or if you cut your losses before they get worse. The machine wasn't together anymore. It wasn't something you could sell easily in pieces without taking a hit. The decision to buy it was done. This was the decision to keep going. June closed the notebook. "Can you get it where it needs to be?" she asked. That was the only question that mattered. Not whether it was going to cost more. It was. Not whether it was going to take time. It would. Just that one thing. Earl didn't answer right away. He looked down at the numbers again, not because he needed to read them, but because that's what he did when he was thinking something through all the way. "I think so," he said. It wasn't said lightly. It wasn't said to reassure her. It was the same kind of answer he'd given at the auction, decided before it was spoken. June nodded once. That was enough for her. She stood up, took the notebook with her, and went to put it back where it always went. No argument, no warning, just an understanding of what the next few months were going to look like. The next weeks settled into a rhythm that didn't leave much room for anything else. Earl worked on the machine in every spare hour he had. Early mornings before the rest of the day started. Evenings after everything else was done. Weekends that used to be slower now filled with parts laid out in order, tools set where he could reach them without thinking, the steady process of taking something apart and bringing it back piece by piece. Some parts he could salvage, clean, measure, reuse. Others had to be replaced. Bearings, seals, lines. The list kept growing, not in a way that surprised him anymore, but in a way that confirmed what he already knew. This wasn't going to be quick. The housing problem took time to solve. Finding a replacement wasn't as simple as making a call. He reached out to yards, to dealers who might have old inventory, to anyone who might know someone who had one sitting somewhere. Most of the answers came back the same. Nothing available, or available at a price that made you stop and think twice. Eventually, he found one. Not local, not easy to get, and not cheap. He paid for it anyway. That was another adjustment to the number. Another step deeper into something that had already gone further than most people would have taken it. By the time the engine came back from the shop, sleeved and ready to go, the total he had written at the kitchen table had already been passed. He didn't go back and rewrite it. He didn't need to. He knew exactly where he stood. The machine was still in pieces, still not running, still not proven. And every part he added back onto it carried the weight of what it cost to get there. That's the part nobody sees when they talk about decisions like the one he made at that auction. They see the number he paid. They don't see the months after. They don't see the point where the original decision stops being the hard one. And the real question becomes whether you're going to finish what you started once you're already too far in to pretend it didn't matter. By the time spring had turned into early summer, the machine looked less like something abandoned and more like something in the middle of becoming, but it still wasn't whole. And that was the part that mattered. From a distance, if you didn't know better, you might have thought it was close. The frame was clean where it needed to be. Parts that had come off months earlier were back in place. Lines had been replaced, fittings tightened, the engine set back where it belonged, bolted in like it had always been there. But distance doesn't tell you anything useful. It's the last 10% that decides whether something works or not, and that last 10% is where most of the risk lives. Earl knew that. He had known it from the start, even if he hadn't said it out loud. That's why he didn't rush now. Not even when everything in front of him looked like it should be ready. Not even when June started asking, not directly, but in the way she did, whether he thought it might run soon. Not even when neighbors passing by slowed down, just enough to look in through the open shed doors and see how far along he was. He didn't give them anything to read. He worked the same way he always had. One thing at a time. Done right. Then move on. The first near stop came on a morning that didn't feel different from the others. No big moment. No sudden failure. Just a quiet realization that had been building for a while finally settling into place. Earl stood in the shed, looking at the machine the way he had looked at it that day in the gravel. Except now he knew more about it than he had then. He knew what it had cost so far. He knew what still wasn't proven. He knew that if something critical had been missed, if something inside that engine didn't hold once it was under real load, all of it could come undone in a way that wouldn't give him a second chance to fix it. The numbers were no longer abstract. They were written down. They were real. He walked back into the house, not fast, not slow, just steady, and sat down at the same table where he had made the decision to keep going weeks earlier. The paper was still there. June had kept it. He looked at it again, not to check the math, but to see it in front of him the way it had been when it was still a choice. It wasn't the same now. Back then, it had been a decision about potential. Now it was a decision about whether to accept the risk that all of that potential might not show up when it mattered. June didn't say anything at first. She saw the look. She knew what it meant. "You thinking about stopping?" she asked. It was the first time either of them had said it out loud. Earl didn't answer right away. He leaned back slightly, hands resting on the edge of the table, eyes still on the numbers. "If it doesn't hold," he said, "that's it." He wasn't talking about money. Not only. He was talking about time, about the season, about everything that had been put into it that couldn't be taken back. June nodded slowly. "And if it does?" Earl looked up then. "Then it works," he said. It sounded simple. It wasn't. She studied him for a second, then gave a small nod. "Then you finish it," she said. That was all. No argument. No push either way. Just the same question she had asked before, answered the same way. "Can you get it where it needs to be?" Earl stood up, went back out to the shed, and picked up where he left off. The second near stop came later, and this one wasn't quiet. This one made itself known the way problems always do when they're real. It was the first start attempt. The machine was together enough by then that there was nothing left to do but try. That's the moment everything leads to. You can spend months building something piece by piece, checking every measurement, tightening every bolt, making sure everything is where it should be, but none of it matters until you turn it over and see what happens when it has to work all at once. Earl didn't make a show of it. He didn't call anyone over. Didn't even tell June he was about to try. He went out early, before the rest of the day had started, the way he liked it when something mattered. He checked the fuel lines again, checked the connections, made sure nothing had been left loose or forgotten. Then he climbed up, sat down in the seat, and turned the key. The engine turned. That was something. It hadn't seized. It hadn't locked up. It moved the way it was supposed to. But it didn't catch. He let it turn a few seconds longer, then stopped. Sat there, hands still on the controls, listening to what wasn't happening. He tried again. Same result. Turning. No ignition. No life. That's the moment most people start doubting everything that came before. Not just the last step. All of it. Earl didn't move right away. He didn't react. He sat there and went through it the way he always did. Fuel delivery. Timing. Compression. One by one. Not guessing. Not hoping. Working it through in order. It took him the better part of that morning to narrow it down. The injection system. It had seemed fine when he cleaned it. It had tested well enough on its own. But under real conditions, it wasn't delivering the way it needed to. One of the valves inside wasn't seating properly. It wasn't something you fix in place. It had to come out. That meant time. More parts. More waiting. He stood there next to the machine, the same machine he had stood under months earlier. And for the first time since the auction, the question was no longer theoretical. It was right there in front of him. Stop now, and you cut the loss where it stands. Keep going, and you add to something that still hasn't proven itself. That's where most people step back. That's where they decide they've gone far enough. Earl didn't make the decision quickly. He didn't need to. He already knew how he was going to approach it. The same way he had approached every other part of the machine. What is it? What does it take to fix it? And is it still worth doing? He made a call that afternoon. Found a rebuilt unit from a specialist who still worked on older systems like this. It wasn't cheap. Nothing was anymore. He ordered anyway. When it came in, he installed it himself. Took his time, checked it twice, made sure everything was exactly where it needed to be. Then he tried again. Same early hour. Same quiet start to the day. This time when he turned the key, the engine didn't just turn. It caught. Not clean at first. Not smooth. It struggled for a second, like it had to remember what it was supposed to do, then it settled. The sound filled the shed in a way it hadn't for years. Not loud, not dramatic, just steady, alive. Earl didn't react the way people expect in moments like that. He didn't smile, didn't say anything. He sat there and listened. That's what mattered. Not that it started, but how it sounded when it did. He let it run for a minute, then longer, watching, listening, feeling for anything that didn't line up. When he finally shut it down, he climbed down and walked around it slowly, the same way he had at the auction, the same way he had when it was just a possibility. This time, it wasn't a question of whether it could be something. It already was. The only thing left was to see if it would hold when it actually had to work. He didn't take it to the field right away. That's something people like to imagine, that the moment a machine comes back to life, you put it straight to work and let the result prove everything at once. Earl didn't do that. He let it run where it was for a while. Not long, but long enough. Different speeds, different loads, listening the whole time. Not for what was obvious, but for what didn't belong. Machines tell you things early if you know how to hear them, and he wasn't going to skip that part just because he had waited this long already. A few small adjustments came out of those first runs. Nothing major. A line that needed tightening again. A bearing that settled in and needed checking. The kind of things that don't mean much on their own, but matter if you ignore them. Once he was satisfied, he shut it down, wiped his hands, and left it alone until the next morning. When he brought it out of the shed for the first time under its own power, there wasn't anyone standing around watching. No neighbors leaning on the fence. No one from the auction. Just Earl, the machine, and the same ground it had been sitting on in pieces not that long before. He didn't make a moment out of it. He drove it slow at first. Not because it couldn't go faster, but because there was no reason to rush something that had taken this long to get right. The field he took it to wasn't far. One of his own. He lined it up, lowered the header, and eased it forward into the first pass. That's where it counts. Not in the shed, not idle, under load, with everything working at once. For a few seconds, there's always that space where you don't know yet, where everything you've done is either about to hold or about to come apart in a way you can't fix quickly. The machine didn't hesitate. It took the crop the way it was supposed to. Clean, steady, no strain in the wrong places, no vibration that shouldn't be there. Earl kept it there, not pushing it, not testing its limits, just letting it do the job it was built to do. After the first pass, he didn't stop. He made another, then another. Same result. When he finally did stop, it wasn't because something was wrong. It was because he had seen enough. He climbed down and walked around it the same way he always had, slow, paying attention, checking what had just been proven under real conditions. Everything he needed to see was there. The machine worked. Not in theory, not in parts. As a whole, that was the first real answer. The second came later, because getting it to run isn't the same as making it worth what you put into it. That part takes time. That season, Earl used it on his own land first. Not pushing for output, just working steady, building hours, making sure what he had rebuilt held up day after day. It did. No major failures. No breakdowns that stopped the work. Just the kind of small maintenance that every machine needs, new or old. Word started to move the way it always does in places like that. Quiet first. Someone sees it running. Someone asks about it. Someone else hears that it's holding up better than expected. By the next season, he wasn't just using it for himself anymore. A neighbor asked if he'd take a few acres, then another. Not because they trusted the machine yet, but because they trusted him. That's how it starts. He charged less than the bigger operations at first. Not by much, but enough to make it an easy decision for someone who wasn't sure. The machine did what it was supposed to do. That's all that mattered. One field at a time, it built its own proof. By the third season, he wasn't looking for work. It was coming to him. More acres, more calls, same machine, same steady approach. He didn't push it past what it should do. Didn't try to make up for lost time. He let the numbers build the way they were supposed to. Over time, that's the part most people never see when they hear about decisions like the one he made. They look for a moment where everything turns, where it becomes obvious that it was the right call. It doesn't happen that way. It happens in pieces. One season, then another. One job that works, then 10 more. By the time you can look back and say it paid off, you've already been living with that decision for years. About 4 years after the auction, Earl sat down at the same table where he had first written out the costs. June brought the books. Not just the expenses this time. Everything. Fuel. Maintenance. What he'd charged. What had come in. What had gone out. They went through it line by line, the same way they always did, not skipping anything, not rounding things in their favor. When they were done, the number was clear. The machine had paid for itself. Not barely. Not in a way you had to justify. Clean. Straight. Everything it had cost was covered, and then some. That was the second answer. The one nobody at that auction would have believed if you told them that morning. The man from the co-op heard about it later. Not from Earl. From someone else. That's how those things travel. Second hand. Third hand. By the time it gets back to you, it's usually lost something. This one hadn't. The number was still there. He didn't say much when he heard. It just nodded once, the way people do when they realize something they had already decided on might not have been complete. He didn't go back and apologize. Men like that don't. But he didn't forget it either. Earl kept running the machine longer than he originally thought he would. Not because he had to, but because it kept doing the job. Year after year. It wasn't perfect. Nothing is. Parts wore out. Things had to be replaced again. But the foundation he had seen that first morning held. That's what mattered. When it finally came time to let it go, it wasn't because it failed completely. It was because something else made more sense at that point. He sold it for less than he paid for it at the auction. If you only looked at those two numbers, you'd think he lost money. That's how most people do the math. They look at the start and the end and ignore everything in between. Earl didn't. The machine had already done its job by then. Everything it had brought in, every acre it had cut, every season it had carried, that was the return. The difference between what he bought it for and what he sold it for wasn't a loss. It was just the cost of owning it over time. That's how he saw it. Years later, his son found the notebook Earl had used that day at the auction. The one with the serial number written in it. The pages were worn, softened at the edges from being carried around for so long. He asked about it once, what the story was behind it. Earl didn't turn it into something bigger than it was. He didn't talk about risk or reward or any of the things people like to attach to stories like that after the fact. He just said it the way he had lived it. Everybody there saw the same machine, he told him. I just looked at it longer than they did. That was it. No lessons spelled out. No point made beyond that. But it was enough. Because that's what the whole thing came down to. Not luck. Not timing. Not something hidden that only he could have known. Just time. The willingness to stay with something a little longer than most people will. Long enough to see what's actually there, instead of what it looks like at a glance. The men at that auction weren't wrong. They saw what was in front of them and made a decision that made sense. Earl did the same thing. He just didn't stop at the first answer. And in the end, that was the only difference that mattered.